Tēnā koutou and welcome to PAI TāTOU, We're Good, a podcast about emotions and mental health brought to you by students and staff from Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. I'm your host, Annemarie Jutel, Professor of Health at Te Herenga Waka and Director of Mata Ora, Encounters Between Medicine and the Arts.
Our guest today is Professor John Randal. He's the Associate Dean Students at the Wellington School of Business and Government. And John was diagnosed with major depression some 10, 15 years ago, weren't you, John?
Yeah, that's correct.
Tell me about how you came to that diagnosis.
I was too tired to ride my bike home. I'm a lifelong cyclist and live in one of Wellington's hill suburbs, Karori, work down in the city. And I started finding myself coming to almost a dead halt on the push bike ride home. And you know, it was either a question of pedaling or falling over. And that was finally my trigger to go to the doctor and see what was going on. He ran all sorts of tests, called me back in a few weeks later and said, well, you don't have cancer, but I think I know what is going on, and that's depression. And with that, about 15 years of sort of strange ups and downs made perfect sense.
So the diagnosis actually explained and put order into this sort of disarray, but these strange things all came together?
Yeah, so I mean, over the become a father, I'd completed a PhD, and before that a master's degree, and before that an undergraduate degree. And sort of throughout that period, the relatively frequent Saturdays where I was curled up in a ball on my bedroom floor, sometimes literally, I'd sort of parked them as perhaps just some element of adult life. And because the other 6 days of the week, I was getting so much stuff done and achieving so much, I sort of ruled it out as anything that I needed to address or act on.
So with that diagnosis, John, what else did you get? Firstly, did you get a sense of wonder or confusion, or did it disturb you to have that label?
I think the overwhelming feeling was relief.
Why, John?
Because all of a sudden the problem was defined and therefore could be attacked. Sort of I'd been through this period where, you know, in hindsight something was wrong, but because I didn't know what it was, I wasn't employing any strategies to deal with it. And so the diagnosis, you know, brought overwhelming relief. And all of a sudden we know what we're dealing with. I know what I'm dealing with. So let's start to try and solve this problem.
So with the diagnosis, you get a treatment or a range of treatments, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Was diagnosis key to you making steps forward to living a happier life or a more functional life? What do you think, in addition to that relief, what were some of the immediate, concrete, or perhaps not immediate, perhaps progressively concrete benefits you took home from having a diagnosis?
I've been taking medication since that diagnosis, but I think the medication that I'm on currently was the 8th or 9th attempt to get that right. This medication, I think, stabilizes my mood at a disappointingly low level. It doesn't feel like a normal level, but at least it's relatively stable.
Could I interrupt you there, just because that's an interesting point you've just made? In fact, stability as opposed to up and down is a place you'd prefer than, say, the highs and the lows?
It's really the deep lows I'm glad to see the back of. You know, so that's and the period of identifying this particular combination of medication was excruciating. And the element of it I really did not like was constantly running diagnostics on myself. How am I? How am I feeling? What things do I need to remember to share with my specialist so that he can, know if this is working or not. Constantly thinking about how I was feeling wasn't a process that I enjoyed.
Yeah.
Partly because, you're an athlete. You know that when you're out for a run or a bike ride and something feels a bit funny and you concentrate on it, before too long, that's all you can feel. And how it feels is often just completely blown out of proportion. I'll sort of spend a ride thinking I've got a really sore knee and then, finish and realize actually everything's sore. But I was so focused on that element that it sort of became overwhelming.
Diagnosis, in a way, was a key to therapy. It was a key to explanation and to understanding. But at the same time, it puts a little bit of a label or an identity on you that you've been forced to focus in on. There must be some advantages to that as well, though. Is the diagnosis a kind of shorthand that allows you to communicate about yourself? What else can you do with this diagnosis?
Yeah, I'm not sure that, I think for me, the really important thing has been self-understanding, sort of just being able to explain the experience of life that I've been having. I don't think depression isn't a word that I utter very often. I certainly feel quite able to tell people that I'm feeling down or that my mood isn't great, and sort of some of them understand that that's the underpinning cause, but it's not really. I don't know if it's actually just having some sense of, yes, this is the underlying cause, but beyond that, I'm not sure it really sort of features from a day-to-day basis.
Is that something that you sometimes have to explain to people? Look at you, you're a tall, healthy fellow who does important work at the university and teaches students, large groups of students, without any difficulty. You're involved in multiple high-level projects, and then you say, and I suffer from major depression. Do people have troubles getting their heads around the fact that a person as able and as successful as you may still have depression and may still need to negotiate that as part of regular challenges of life?
I hope it does challenge people, because I think it sometimes it forces us to assess the assumptions that we're making about mental illness, and about the ability to operate at a high level.
What are those assumptions, John?
I think that if we assume that if someone has a mental illness, then their mental cognition or their ability is not, is somehow diminished. And I think that's absolutely true at times, but it's not true, universally, sort of over a period of time. So I think that's an important thing. And I guess the other challenge is that there's absolutely, I have absolutely no, I'm not ashamed of it. I don't feel like it's something I have to keep hidden as a way of managing the risk of how people might react.
Some diagnoses bring with them a stigma. And at the same time, some diagnoses bring with them sort of a legitimization of things that otherwise might not be, as welcome socially. People perhaps with a diagnosis of depression are maybe allowed by virtue of that diagnosis to express themselves or to think about expressing themselves, both for the social benefit that brings. You're talking about challenging assumptions sort of more broadly. With this diagnosis almost comes an understanding of how important, an understanding that someone who hasn't been diagnosed or who goes through life a little bit more la-di-da might not even occur to them. And doing so in certain settings is quite important to you.
There's one comment that I don't think I'll ever forget. And one of the first times at work that I was speaking openly about depression and myself was actually the manager of student counselling said to me afterwards, "It must have been really hard to talk about it." And I said, "It's not hard to talk about, it's hard to have." But the conversation, it's an easy thing to do relative to dealing with it on a daily basis. So,
do you remember the first time you disclosed that to someone who had power over you? Do you remember what that felt like?
I remember that the individual who I trusted, cared. I remember thinking, this person feels like he has no levers. But I remember thinking, if you'd offered me a hug, that would have been more useful than the things that you felt that you could offer. And that was something that that I've raised recently. That actually our managers need genuine levers, need better training.
I'm going to close by asking you a question about that discomfort. So your manager actually wasn't as well trained as you might have hoped they would be, and yet you disclosed to them all the same. So the people listening to this podcast may be weighing up the decision to disclose or not to disclose. What words of wisdom would you give them, knowing that they may or may not get quite the reception they hoped for? They might get a better reception than they ever dreamed of. But how would you advise somebody on that matter?
I remember thinking that whether I say it or not, it doesn't change the underlying issue. So the problem is there whether I tell anyone or not. And so, my view was that if someone knows, then they're better able to interpret what they're seeing, and they may be able to help. I've had some incredible opportunities at work since making the disclosure. When I told the entire university, I was a senior lecturer and now I'm a professor. I've had a 2-month stint in the senior leadership team, where every individual in that room was aware of the fact that I have depression. And so, entrusting people, I think we kind of anticipate what it might be like. We guess, and probably people with depression guess in the most sort of dark and terrible, anticipate the most terrible potential outcomes. But actually, it was empowering. It was unburdening, and it's there's literally not been a single conversation that I've had where I've sort of wished that I hadn't been open about it.
That was John Randal, and I'm Annemarie Jutel. PAI, TＡ'TOU.